Special welcome to our speakers tonight, and it's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Frank Olding. Frank is a native of Gwent. Before early retirement, he worked in the heritage and archaeology sectors for over 30 years. He was chair of the executive committee of the Monmouthshire Eisteddfod in 2016. 2 volumes of his poetry have been published by Gwasg y Mynydd Du in 2012 and Eilyn in 2019. He also is the author of Archaeoleg Ucheldir Gwent, The Archaeology of the Gwent Highlands in 2016 by the Royal Commission of Ancient Monuments in Wales. He's a member of the Gorsedd of Bards and a fellow of the FSA. And he is the present honorary president of Cymdeithas Carnianog. He says he is not a scholar, but he has, in his own words, but he has a lively interest in the Welsh tradition of Gwent and the environs. It's wonderful, Frank, to be able to welcome you, and we look forward very much to your presentation. Thank you. Thank you. I hope now that you can see in the first picture. Thanks for the invitation. Thomas Phillips and the Blue Books. Villain or hero? Perhaps this isn't where you would expect me to start, but I will explain later on about the amazing career of Thomas Phillips. Thomas Phillips was born in Ynys associated with the Clydach Iron Works in 1808. And this is the site by now, and the Clydach Iron Works from the air. And this is how it was when Thomas Phillips was born at the beginning of the 19th century. In 1824, he moved to Newport to train as a lawyer. And there, he worked in partnership with Thomas Brother, another lawyer from the south, until 1840. He was an industrialist and felt that he needed to work to manage the workers with an iron hand, but he was also very firmly against inequalities. In Newport, he was very active in the civic life and associated with John Frost. John Frost had laboured for decades to secure voting rights for the voter. His main opponent was Thomas Brother, William Brownell, the coroner, and Thomas Phillips himself. By the crisis rate led to the 1832 Reform Act, Frost became more and more radical and said that moderate radicals like Thomas Phillips were emissaries of the people. But Thomas Phillips was one of the most noisy brawlers for reform in this period, actually. There was a duality in Thomas Phillips's but when the Act came, it didn't do much to expand the franchise, and the disappointment was severe. Frost, first of all, intended to argue through the democratic system. Basically, he was a moderate Whig, and the Corporation Act 1835 had created elected councils to manage the new boroughs created in wake of the Act. All taxpayers or ratepayers had the right to vote, although there were very few of them. So following these changes, John Frost succeeded in being elected as mayor of Newport in 1836, but he was unsuccessful, and there was furious debates. The Whigs then took over the post of mayor for 3 years, and Thomas Phillips himself became mayor in 1839. All this created more bitterness between Frost and Phillips. In the meantime, the Chartists revolt had grown, and John Frost started the Working Men's Association in Monmouthshire. By January 1839, over 400 Chartists had been enlisted, and in February 1839, their central leaders, Henry Vinton, a young charismatic orator, was sent to proselytize for the court. Thousands came to hear from Glamorganshire and Gwent, and he became the people's champion. In addressing a meeting of hundreds of people in Newport, Henry Vincent wished to see Thomas Phillips as a partner and his Thomas brother hanging on the lamppost behind him. It was obvious, therefore, that feelings on both sides were hardening, and Thomas Phillips sent regular letters to the government in London, warning that a number of the rebels and the extremists were growing locally. By April, Thomas Phillips feared that Newport would be soon in the hands of the mob, and he wrote to the Home Secretary to remind him that there were no special constables. In April, Thomas Phillips announced an order outlawing public meetings, warning the public from holding, and prevented publicans from using charters from using their premises. Frost declared again that Thomas Phillips was an enemy of the people, and that this was a declaration of war against the people's rights. By now, the gentry of the county were also establishing associations for the protection of life and property, which Frost supported. And Phillips organised meetings of the yeomanry in Gleision, just outside Newport. And therefore, it was legal. They came to be known as the Crouchers Yeomanry. All this was alleged was a plot by Thomas Phillips to arm themselves secretly. And in that sense, it was right. In May, Phillips succeeded in ensuring that Henry Vincent would be arrested in London. Vincent was sent to Monmouth to be prosecuted for illegal assembly, and he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 months in prison. In May, 30,000 people gathered in a huge rally in Blackwood calling for his release. The Chartists across the kingdom had been collecting signatures for a national petition for months. By the 12th of July, the petition was presented to Parliament, and thousands of signatures, but this was rejected. The Chartists had always been split into two: the labourers and those who were more moderate. With the failure of the national petition, it was the physical force those who and they held a public meeting in Dukestown in Treachery. There were over 40,000 people present. By now, the Chartists also were beginning to arm themselves. In August, the Chartist Convention noted a date for an armed rebellion. And in September and August, therefore, was a great period of activity in Blaenau Gwent. And 50 people met in the Royal Oak, where John Frost encouraged people to calm down until the rest of Britain was ready to join them. But at a secret meeting after the public meeting, an attack was planned on Newport on the 3rd of November. The plan was all for the Chartists in all parts of Monmouthshire to come to near the Royal Oak in Risca to march down from Stow Hill to Newport. In the meantime, they'd been meeting secretly in different places along includes the Charters Cave here, as shown here. And on Sunday, the 4th of November, Thomas Phillips had sent scouts out northwards to look for the Chartists. Soldiers from the 45th Foot were in the workhouse and special constables on duty in the Westgate Hotel, where prisoners from amongst the Chartists were being held. The following morning, by 8 o'clock, Thomas Phillips and the soldiers were in the Westgate, and by 9:30, 5,000 Chartists, armed Chartists, had reached, and the shooting had begun. It is apparent that Thomas Phillips himself had hoped to avoid violence, but eventually he was responsible for giving the order for the soldiers to shoot. In opening the shutters to facilitate this, he was himself shot in the arm. And here we are, with a sort of rather primitive or fancy sling. During the fierce fighting followed within the hotel, at least 3 of the Chartists tried to kill Phillips, and 2 of them were shot. The men went to shot the rioters through the hotel windows. The Battle of Westgate had lasted for a little over 20 minutes. 22 people were dead and over 50 had been injured. And this is the description of one eyewitness.
There was a scene dreadful beyond expression. The groans of the dying, the shrieks of the wounded, the pallid, ghostly countenances and the bloodshot eyes of the dead, in addition to the shattered windows and passages ankle-deep in gore.
Immediately after the revolt, Thomas Phillips was knighted, and a luxury dinner in Newport, an enormous silver plate worth £200 was presented to him. He was also given the freedom of the City of London. He went on, as part of a lawyer, to prepare the court case against the Chartists, and particularly to bring a charge of treason against John Frost and the other leaders, Zephaniah Williams and William Jones. And here are some of the pictures of the riot, dreadful riot. And this is the record in the parish record of burying a dozen nameless Chartists where the cathedral stands today. So, Thomas Phillips brought a case against the Chartist leaders for the trial which was to take place in Monmouth. But in his zeal for justice, Thomas Phillips did quite some doubtful things. During the preliminary investigations, he and Thomas Prothero offered money and jobs to those who were willing to testify against the Chartists. All defendants had a legal right to see a list of the witnesses who testify against them. Thomas Phillips and others were very anxious to prevent this until the very last minute, which was, of course, totally illegal. The result of these inconsistencies, the final case, a sentence to be changed from death to deportation for life in Van Diemen's Land. So all Thomas Phillips's attempts to ensure that the Chartist leaders would be executed were in vain. After the revolt, the authorities in London tried to analyse this, and so it was the irregular nature of the Welsh people who caused this, and very ironically, Thomas Phillips rushed to defend the Welsh. It has often been asserted that the insurrection of 1839 was Welsh in its origin and character, and carried on with more secrecy, being contrived by persons who communicated with each other in a language not understood by the authorities. This idea, however, is a mistaken one, for the plan of the rising, if not concerted with Englishmen, was known to some of the Chartist leaders in Scotland and England. So, shortly after the revolt, Thomas Phillips travelled to London, although he also had a home in Llanelin in Monmouthshire, and he was called to the bar in 1842, and shortly afterwards he left for a journey around parts of Europe and the Middle East, visiting Greece, Italy, Palestine, and Egypt. The young artist Richard Dadd went with him, and this is responsible for the fact that Thomas Phillips is portrayed here in Arabic dress in this place, portrayed by Richard Dadd. But of course, Richard Dadd's sad history is fairly well known by now. In my notes, he suffered from mental illness. Well, in fact, he went totally mad, and he had to be sent home. And after he reached home, he murdered his father and was incarcerated in an asylum. Thomas Phillips had employed him to take him with him to record the journey in the Middle East. Thomas Phillips, therefore, became Queen's Counsel, worked with parliamentary committees. He was very active with the Brecon College, was president of the Society of Arts, and he devoted a lot of his time to promote education, and he gave generously to various charities. He died in 1867 and was buried in Llanelin. So at the first sight, Thomas Phillips wasn't the most likely people to plead the case of the Welsh workers, but that's what happened. What excited him, of course, was what is called the treason of the Blue Books. Now, you won't get a very pleasant look on the books. The contents was very one of the sort of cliched portraits, although the contents is legendary by now. And although some historians try to belittle their psychological effect on the West, I think their effect is long-lasting. According to those who drew up the report, the Welsh as a nation were dirty, lazy, ignorant, superstitious, immoral, and extremely unchaste. Even their interest in theology was criticised by R.W. Ingham.
Poetical and enthusiastic warmth of religious feeling, careful attendance upon religious services, zealous interest in religious knowledge, the comparative absence of crime are found side by side with the most unreasoning prejudices or impulses, an utter want of method in thinking and acting, and what is far worse, with a widespread disregard of temperance, of chastity, of veracity, and of fair dealing. A mae'n hawdd anghofio effaith hyn I gyd ar y Cymru. Dyma Jellinger C. Simmons, and fwy rhag fanllid byth. The evidence given me of the immoral character of the Welsh people, with a few exceptions, tells the same tale. The Welsh are peculiarly exempt from the guilt of great crimes. There are few districts in Europe where murders, burglaries, personal violence, rapes, or felonies on a large scale are so rare. On the other hand, there are perhaps few countries where the standard of minor morals is lower. Petty thefts, lying, cousining, chicanery, drunkenness, and idleness prevail to a great extent among the least educated part of the community.
Now the women of Wales became particularly blameworthy. And also the prayer meetings for some meetings. These prayer meetings had in the minds of commissioners sort of Sodom and Gomorrah.
The great number of nightly prayer meetings and punkai schools lead to bad results. They are places at which lovers agree to meet, from which they return together at late hours. At these schools, young persons of both sexes are congregated together in great numbers and in close contact. Such are the circumstances under which the early life of a Welsh peasant girl is passed. So far from wondering at what is said of them, that they are almost universally unchaste, the wonder would be if they were otherwise.
And non-conformity, of course, in the Welsh language takes the blame for this. For some reason, some of the commissioners also were worried about the administration of justice in Wales, although that was outside their remit.
The evil of the Welsh language is obviously and fearfully great in courts of justice. It distorts the truth, favours fraud, and abets perjury, which is frequently practiced in courts and escapes detection through the loopholes of interpretation. This public exhibition of successful falsehood has a disastrous effect on public morals and regard for truth. The mockery of an English trial of a Welsh criminal by a Welsh jury addressed by counsel and judge in English is too gross and shocking to need comment.
The answer, in the Commissioner's opinion, was to do away with the Welsh language.
It would extend the influence and power of the Church. Consequence on this would be the general improvement of the people in due deference to their superiors and respect for the law of the land. Well,
Thomas Phillips was infuriated by these comments, and he collected evidence to the contrary.
Born in the Principality, speaking its language and accustomed from my earliest years to associate with its inhabitants, I might claim to speak with the authority of a witness, but I forbear to do so, and when conclusions of the commissioners are impugned, no other materials will be employed than official returns published by the government.
He wanted to use firm evidence to refute these allegations, and this is the Wales language, social conditions, moral character, and religious opinions of the people, published in 1849. Thomas Phillips drew the world's attention to the unfairness of the Blue Books.
The reports contain deductions hastily drawn, generalizations from few and insufficient particulars, and the gravest imputations on the moral character of a whole people, based upon representations applicable only to particular districts or influenced by exceptional circumstances.
He was particularly anxious to defend the women of Wales against the allegations of unchastity.
Imputations upon moral character, especially such as affect the reputation of the women of a whole district, demand a rigid inquiry and a prompt refutation. Such imputations, instead of being cast at random in public reports, which from their character give force and poignancy to the charge, should be conveyed in language carefully weighed and strictly limited to the extent and character of the evil. It is the admission of men who have travelled far and seen much, but in no country have they found women of greater gentleness and interest than the peasant girls of Wales. And yet it is of these young women that language is employed, but so far from wondering that they are almost universally unchaste, the wonder would be if they were otherwise.
Thomas Phillips defended his fellow Welshmen, clearly, but perhaps in a rather British way, which strikes us as rather strange.
These descriptions, penned by English writers, devoured by English readers, and countenanced by English rulers, are circulated not of distant lands, separated from us by wide intervals, but of a people amongst whom Englishmen dwell, with whom they associate and intermarry, and from whom many of the nobles of England are descended. A people distinguished by their courteous bearing, by their hospitality to strangers, and by preserving unimpaired many of the virtues which characterize a primitive life.
He also proceeded to defend the nonconformists and the dissenters.
There are two prevailing models of describing the influence of dissent in that country, of which one consists in attributing to Welsh people more gross immorality and fanatical ignorance, joined to lofty spiritual pretensions, than is found in any other part of Europe, and the other of claiming for them an amount of piety, good morals, and religious information unequaled in any other country. Neither of these methods is satisfactory, and whilst I deplore immoral practices which prevail in Wales, and am grieved by religious divisions and subdivisions, I cannot affirm the superiority of conduct and holiness of life of the English peasantry over those dissenting worshippers who inhabit the mountain fastnesses of my own land.
As a barrister, he also wanted to show that there was no basis for the fact that the language prevented the work of the courts.
No answer has yet been given to the charge of widespread disregard of veracity and the habitual occurrence of perjury in courts of justice. The accusation of habitual perjury is confined to one report, and the evidence offered for so serious a charge is inadequate to support an indictment against the whole people. Two gentlemen of Cardiganshire, one of them a barrister and the other a magistrate's clerk, and one gentleman of Breconshire, seem to be the only authorities for this imputation. The barrister says the Welsh language is peculiarly evasive, which originates from its having been the language of slavery. This postprandial deduction was scarcely worth recording in a report on education by a government commissioner, unless upon the principle that it would be buried deeper in a blue book than in any other grave.
Postprandial does suggest perhaps an overindulgence in drink.
In 1846, not only was there no conviction, but no accusation of perjury in Wales and Monmouthshire.
I also proposed a solution. Thomas Phillips suggested that the best way of getting Welsh children to speak English was to educate them through the medium of Welsh. It was foolishness to teach them to read English only.
In recommending that those children whose native language is Welsh should be so instructed in their own tongue as to read it with understanding, expression is given to convictions not formed hastily, but after much deliberation. If children whose ordinary language is Welsh are taught to read English only, their minds can rarely be influenced, nor can much knowledge be given them in the limited period over which their school instruction extends.
According to these ideas, Thomas Phillips sought himself to establish a school in Llanelyn outside Abergavenny, where the education was bilingual. One of the Bibles, the bilingual Bible used by the children, is still in Abergavenny Museum, and he also funded other schools for the children of the miners. Thomas Phillips was determined to defend the character and good name of the Welsh as a nation. And when we remember how few other people wanted to link themselves with this as well, at all, he was a lone figure. He had to protest in the official language. And that's what Thomas Phillips did. And although his attempts were in vain, we should remember our debt to him. He should have an honourable place in the history of Welsh identity. And to finish, here is a picture of Llanelyn House, where Thomas Phillips lived, and the church in Llanelyn, where he was buried in 1867. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for that presentation. I knew hardly anything about Thomas Phillips, and that's true of many of the characters who've appeared in this series. Thank you very much. There's an opportunity now for anybody who wants to make a comment or to ask a question. As I say, you could say at the beginning, you can do that by raising your hand or through using the chat button. Or you can put the question in the chat. I can't see anything in the chat at the moment, unless somebody's typing as I speak. May I ask a question, Frank, please? Obviously, Thomas Phillips did defend the Welsh and defend the Welsh language and battled against the insulting comments contained in the Blue Books. Obviously, there was a strong link with the established church. Do we know anything further about his relationship with the other denominations? With nonconformity? You did mention that he defended nonconformists against the accusations in the Blue Books. Do we know anything further about that? As his beliefs as a Christian and this bilingual Bible? It's difficult to say at the beginning of his career, when he was in the middle of the political upheavals and so on. But it is apparent in the second part of his career that he showed a great deal of respect towards the nonconformist. He, of course, was a man of the Church of England, as it was then, and believed sincerely that government sovereignty of the and the Church of England went hand in hand. But he never showed anything but respect to the nonconformists. And that, of course, is one of the things that were at the root of the fury of the response to the Blue Books, that they insulted it seemed to be a plot on behalf of the Church of England to attack the nonconformists and so on. And I think that Thomas Phillips also felt the injustice that Anglicans in Wales, this problem had come in, and that the Anglican Church in Wales had the same sort of injustice as the nonconformists. For instance, he criticised Thomas Price Carnianog and his attempts to open a school, and they criticised any such similar attempts by the Welsh Anglican clergymen. So there might be some sort of standing up for the Church of England in Wales as well as standing up for the nonconformists. When he attempted to he stood out, didn't he, amongst those in the established church in Wales, and who were pleased and did regret the growth of nonconformity because they were firm Anglicans. Yes, he stood out against, well, for the language, but also for those who were nonconformists as well. There was a duality here in a way. Although he was certainly in favour of the established church and the Anglican expression of the faith, at the same time he wanted to give the nonconformists and the dissenters the freedom to express the different way that they saw, and that sincerely and in an open manner. Oh yes, and we must remember that Thomas Phillips was part of, well, a movement, perhaps that's the wrong word, in Abergavenny and the area, and there was Thomas Price Carnianog, and the Lady Llanover were part of this. The old literary parsons had their influence here. So there was a sort of Anglicanism which was very firmly in favour of the Welsh language, and it was part of the tradition in Gwent in this period. Thomas Price, Thomas Phillips, although Lady Llanover. Perhaps Thomas Phillips represents the end of that tradition of Welsh Anglicans who were fervent in favour of the language. Yes, excellent. And it's good to hear the voices of those people and to understand really how complex all this was in this period, and hearing about his contribution. Thank you very much for that. I don't see anybody else asking any questions or making comments, so I think we'll have a 5-minute break sincerely thank Frank for his excellent presentation. We will reconvene soon after 10 to 8 for our second speaker. Well, friends, welcome back. I hope you've had an opportunity to have a cup of tea or something, and that we're ready to rejoin for our second presentation tonight. In preparing to present some of our speakers, and Wyn James, I must prepared, I don't think he really needs much introduction, since he's contributed so many times already during this series. Apart from Wyn, I don't think this series would have really got off the ground. He's been the architect of all this through his enthusiasm and his scholarship, and we are extremely grateful to him for the work he's done to ensure the success of the series. Well, tonight we welcome him to speak about John Griffith, the alternative bishop and the remarkable Anglican revival in the second half of the 19th century. Before retiring, Professor Wyn James was professor at the School of Welsh at the University of Cardiff and joint director of the Wales and America Institute of Studies. He's an expert in the study, an expert on the Welsh culture of the 16th century on. His research areas includes the hymn and the ballad, the anti-slavery movement, and the Welsh colony in Patagonia. He is a fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, the National Hymn Society, and the International Ballad Commission. He was a visiting fellow in Cambridge in 2004 and a Fulbright scholar and a visiting scholar at Harvard in 2012. It's a privilege to welcome you here, Wyn, and we look forward very much to your contribution, and thank you. Well, thank you, Ainsley, for that kind presentation, and apologies to begin with. I don't have a PowerPoint, which was the most interesting that Frank gave, and also apologise. In this session, I'll be making quite a lot of sweeping statements. Some of you who know more about the period, I'm sure will want to make comments. But the first point to make is that it doesn't look very well for the Anglican Church in Wales in 1851. It was the established church and would remain so for about 70 years until disestablishment in 1920. But the census in 1951, how weak that church was in comparison with the nonconformist sect. About half the population of Wales attended a place of worship, but only 1 in 5, that is about 20%, would attend an Anglican church. The rest, the other 80%, went to nonconformist churches, Baptists, Congregationalists, Wesleyans, and Methodists. And this, of course, showed the religious revolution that had been afoot for over about a century, especially in the wake of the evangelical revivals, which shook Wales from about the middle of the 18th century on. That is, they'd started in the established church, what we call the Methodist revival, but which spread increasingly to the old nonconformists and dissenters from about 1770 on. It was a reform or revival movement which started particularly in the south, but which spread increasingly to the north, particularly after the evangelical cleric Thomas Charles moved to Bala and turned Bala into sort of headquarters for the evangelizing and teaching campaigns across the north. And Thomas Charles also led the Methodist movement, which until the beginning of the 19th century was a revival movement within the Anglican established church in the name, at least. He led that to take the step, the inevitable step, although very reluctantly on behalf of Charles himself and many other Methodists, particularly in the south, to ordain their own ministers and become, therefore, a separate non-conformist denomination. and swelled, of course, the ranks of the nonconformists in Wales. Although we need to emphasise that it was quite a fluid relationship between the Methodists and the Anglicans at the beginning of the 19th century, particularly so in Dyfed and in the Vale of Glamorgan. There are plenty of examples of Methodist sons becoming Anglican clerics. But the result of all this was to see nonconformist chapels opening practically every week on average between 1800 and 1805 across Wales, as most of those affected by these evangelical revivals joined the ranks of the nonconformists, including, of course, by this time, the Methodists. And with the Anglican Church becoming increasingly becoming a minority in Wales and reduced, therefore, its influence in society. Other factors were afoot, which meant that things weren't particularly looking good for the Anglican Church by the mid-19th century. And to note some of those very briefly, Wales, of course, became more increasingly in 1750s, which was quite confirmative, had become quite radical in the 1850s. And by 1851, we were on the threshold of a nonconformist hegemony, which increasingly became increasingly important in the second half of the 19th century. And many nonconformist ministers were prominent leaders in this. And although there were exceptions, the church, although there were exceptions, tended to be conservative and establishment belonging to the old hierarchical strategy where the squire and the priest were a mixer, were the leaders in their community. The old hegemony, which was increasingly being toppled by the new non-conformist liberal tendency as the century proceeded. And the chapels, of course, were also much more democratic establishments, in name at least, than the churches as regards Anglican hierarchy. What another thing is true about the 19th century is that we see a significant growth in Welsh patriotism. The Anglicans, again, as we've already heard, were quite prominent in the Welsh revival in the first part of the 19th century. The old literary parsons, an incorporation of that feeling, and their great interest in the Eisteddfodau, in the Cymrigyddion y Fenni, but there was a significant change at about the mid-century. The death of Carnianawg in 1848 was a blow to the influence and the relationship of the Anglicans in leading a national or patriotic Welsh feeling. He, to a large degree, from about 1818 on until his death in 1840, was the glue which kept the movement together, the cultural patriotic movement together across all sorts of social divisions and political divisions. Also, Lady Llanover lost a lot of her influence from the 1850s on. And of course, although the number of Anglicans raised their voices against the what we've heard in the Blue Books and we've heard in the first talk, the fact that it was Anglicans who drew up this report, criticising the language, criticising the morals of the Welsh women and non-conformity. Those reports provided endless ammunition for those in the new liberal non-conformist hegemony and they could use them against the established church and enable them to propose it as the old anti-Welsh and anti-Welsh language establishment. And generally, we saw in the second half of the century, again, I generalise, but we see nonconformists taking over from Anglicans as leaders of the Welsh movements, and the disestablishment of the church becoming increasingly higher, climbing up the agenda of the national movement, particularly in the Cymru Fydd period at the end of the century. Another thing we see in the period up to 1851 is the demographic changes, tremendous demographic changes, particularly in the south. Huge growth in population of the industrialization. The population of Wales grew from something like 500,000 to a little over 1 million by 1851, doubled. And by then, 40% of the population lived in Glamorgan and Gwent, and several of the course in the valleys of Glamorgan and Gwent, which were previously sparsely populated areas, a scattered population. And as regards the established church, was serviced by wide-ranging, geographically wide parishes, where the nonconformists could respond quickly to these demographic changes. It wasn't as easy for the Anglican Church and its bureaucracy. We're reminded of the parody of the onward Christian soldiers, if I remember. Like a mighty tortoise moves the Church of God. And in the case of the Anglican Church in the industrial valleys of the south in the beginning of the 19th century, the situation was not unlike this description of the area of Sheffield.
Where the national church required an act of parliament, a grant of money, an educated gentleman, and a crop of lawyers, the Methodists required only a friendly barn and a zealous preacher.
On top of all these considerations, the established church was not in the best situation internally either, bearing in mind the sort of things that clerics, Welsh clerics in Yorkshire were firm against the Anglicisation of the bishops, nepotism, the poor condition of the buildings and so on. And an extreme example of this was seeing one of the bishops of Llandaf appointing his son, his 5-year-old son, registrar of the parish, and then he received a total of about £40,000 in fees across his long period as registrar. And of course, he was absent for the whole time. One of the leaders in favour of Henry Richard, who was in favour of disestablishment, and the son of a famous Methodist preacher, and Henry Richard himself had been a minister in London before becoming an MP. He thundered against the condition of the established church in Wales, portraying it not as an old mother, but as wicked stepmother, failing to provide for religious nourishment from the somewhat withered breasts. And in criticising and arguing strongly, of course, that it was the poor condition of the church, the established church in Wales, was responsible for the strength of the Methodists, and nonconformity had left it, and did so reluctantly because of the poor condition of the church. He was quoting the criticism of her own children, people like Thomas Phillips, against the established church. But surprisingly, in view of all these factors which I've sketched, what we see in the church in Wales from about 1850 onwards, and particularly in the southeastern valleys, was some sort of new vitality. Indeed, that regeneration proved so strong roughly between 1850 and 1870, so that many historians, recent historians, can describe it as the most prosperous and splendid period in the in the history of the Anglican Church in Wales since the Protestant Reformation. Avion Evans, for instance, talked about it as a Pentecostal period. Now, it is a period which could be said that the church in Wales proved a revival or an evangelical revival, and that quite strongly, particularly in the industrial valleys of the southeast and wider throughout Wales, particularly in the South Wales valleys. Now, the word evangelical has arisen several times already in my talk, but perhaps I should pause a moment and think of the definition, particularly in the way that it is used in America in our own days. Now, traditionally, evangelical is used to describe Orthodox Protestant Christians characterized by 4 core emphases, and I follow here the definition of the definition of the church historian David Bevington. One thing was that the Bible had a central place as the final authority in matters of faith. Another thing we see is a great emphasis on the death of Christ on the cross as the only way to bring God and people together. Another thing we see is the emphasis on the need for individuals, not enough for individuals to accept the creeds of the church, but they had to accept that personally, that is, in the heart as well as the head, if you like. That they had to come to sort of personal experience of God and salvation. That is, that revolutionary personal change we call as rebirth or conversion. And what follows from these 3 things is, in fact, practical action. In the humanitarian way, and you think of the first part of the 19th century, evangelical people who were foremost in the anti-slavery movement, for instance, and spiritually as well. There was a great activity in evangelizing, preaching, teaching. Thomas Charles O'Bala is an exceptional example of this. Now, the change that the established church proved in this evangelical revival between about 1850 and 1870 and in the southern valleys, it was quite startling, in fact. In Llandaff diocese, the number of clerics increased from 50 in 1850 to 170 in 1870. And much of that increase was the appointment of curates who acted in the wider spread parishes as the foot soldiers of this crusade. In the same period in the Llandaff diocese, we saw the erection of 32 new churches, together with the allocation of about 60 other rooms for Anglican worship. And there were hundreds coming to listen to these powerful preachers who were appointed two posts in these new parishes in the valleys of Gwent and Glamorgan. Now, we must remember also that this wasn't something which grew from nothing in this period. There were several elements that contributed to this. We must remember that there was a constant growth in the evangelical branch of the established church in Wales in the decades after the Methodists seceded from the established church. Indeed, it would be worth comparing growth of evangelicalism in Wales and in the established church during the first part of the 19th century, and indeed before that, to the tide rather than a sudden flow. What you had was a wave after wave, each of them reaching slightly higher than the previous one, building up, if you like, building on each other. These waves flowed up the beach, if you like, then receded, but then the next wave went that little bit further, creeping closer to the shore. And in that process, although it was the non-conformist sects which benefited mostly in numbers, there was a constant growth in the evangelical branch of the established church as well. One thinks of people such as the Richards family of Dorwen, Carniannog himself, Ieuan Glangerionydd, David Parry, the Silver Bell, because of his powerful preaching, Archdeacon John Hughes of Aberystwyth, only to name only a few, the most prominent amongst the evangelists of the established church in the first part of the 19th century. We must also remember, although there was tension between the various evangelical sects, in the different denominations and indeed within them, on even such as Calvinism, for instance, and theological and the church organization, we are in danger of overemphasizing the differences while not forgetting that those people were united in their creeds and emphasis and their basic ethos across the denominations. And I quote here, R.T.D. Jones here, what characterized the horde of Christians of Wales across the denominational borders in the first part of the 19th century, increasingly in this period, and including many in the established church, what characterized this period for many Christians was what T.D. Jones called a consensus of evangelical accord, which did cross denominational boundaries, especially between the Methodist and the established church. An example of that is fact a comment by a cleric about the scores of people he saw flowing into church in North Cardiganshire during the 1859 revival. He emphasizes in talking about the church, it's not the established church, I mean, but Christ's church across the boundaries. And he said,
I am not so bigoted as to think that the Church of God is not among the Methodists, etc., though they differ from us in minor points.
Now, the 1859 revival happened in this period of regeneration of the established church in the South Wales valleys and further. in the 1850-70 period, and that the effect of that revival was significant on the established church across Wales. It is said, for instance, that the churches of Wales across the denominations gained about 100,000 new members during the 1859 revival. And about 20,000 of those, that is about 20%. The percentage of church attenders were new communicants to the established church. And in several senses, you can argue that the period of revival and following was a high tide of the evangelicalism in the established church in Wales, and to a large degree in the cases of the other denominations as well. There were internal factors as well. In addition to this, the general revival movement, if you like, were at work in promoting evangelism in the established church. And I can't go into detail on that. There were few factors such as the willingness of some bishops after the Methodists seceded, the willingness of some to ordain evangelical preachers of a Methodistical leaning, you might say. Improvements in the administration of the church, following the Church Commission establishing societies such as the Church Pastoral Aid Society, and particularly in Llandaff Diocese, the support of the industrialist, the second Marquess of Bute, to the evangelical wing of the church, and also the appointment of an evangelical Bishop Oliphant in Llandaff in 1849, which had an effect until 1882. There's no time to go into detail on those factors, but before I close, I would like to mention a little about the most prominent leader of this group of evangelical leaders in the southeastern valleys. John Griffith. Griffith without the S, notice. We can't go into detail about him. In one sense, we don't need to, because one of the many favours that grounded in the history of that Roger Brown biography of John Griffith in the year 2006. He was originally from Ceredigion. John Griffith was, and therefore came from that part of the country that Roger Brown calls an evangelical heartland. He came to university in Cambridge, came to the attention of second Marquess of Bute and was appointed Vicar of Aberdare in 1846, became infamous because of his critical comments on the moral character of the authors of the Blue Books. Hugh Hughes, the artist, made a cartoon of him being provoked by Ieuan Gwynedd, and what he infuriated the nonconformists was his allegation that, properly speaking, there is no religion whatever, and he just reached his parish. But in his writings, John Griffith is equally harsh on the deficiencies of the established church as he was those of the nonconformists. and he went to reform and constantly the situation in his parish. 3 new churches were erected during his period there in Aberdare, and the number of curates was increased to 3, and hundreds came to listen to his powerful preaching. And there were similar developments, and he moved to be rector of Merthyr, and he stayed until his death, and became very prominent in his humanitarian work amongst the working classes, the soup kitchens at times of economic depression. John Griffith was a strong character, and there was increasing constant between him and the hierarchy of the diocese, including the bishop himself. Although, despite his general sympathy, he was unhappy with about John Griffith's choice of curates. Most of them came from Ceredigion, and a rather peasant class, but evangelical in spirit, Welsh in language, and could be therefore quite close to the people they served. And indeed, by the end of his life, John Griffith stated support for the disestablishment of the church, although remained faithful himself to the Anglican Church. If I have about another 2 minutes, I know that time is going on, but I should note that it's interesting to note John Griffith, as a number of the other evangelical clergymen, described as those they had more in common with the evangelical nonconformists than his fellow Anglicans. And that was obviously being said about a number of the other leaders. John Griffiths, notice the S, in Llandaf, who was vicar of Neath between 1855 and 1896. Both the two are very often mixed because of the confused, but they were similar. They were both from Ceredigion, both powerful preachers, both achieved revival work in their parishes. And John Griffiths of Neath was very prominent in the Eisteddfod movement and cooperated very closely with the nonconformists, with the militant movement in Neath, which created, of course, tensions with the diocesan authorities. And although the influence of evangelical clergymen in Blaenau Gwent continued after the 1870s, and continued in the case of John Griffith himself and David Howell, William Evans of Rhymney, and so on. And their influence changed the situation of the church. By the 1901, in 1851, the numbers, only one in four of the church attenders were Anglican, but their influence was declining in the South Wales valleys, and each in turn was Tractarians came in their place under the influence of the third Marquis of Bewes, who was more tender towards the Tractarians than the evangelicals. And the hope of the evangelical clergymen was that the church reform and the evangelical revival, which the Anglican Church had proved in the 50s and 70s, would attract the evangelical Methodists back, and to realise the wish of Daniel Rowland of seeing the evangelical bees returning to their hive. But what happened, of course, was the growth of Tractarianism undermined most of the evangelical clergymen in the Gwent and Glamorgan valleys. That is the emphasis on tradition. If we think of the tradition and reason, they emphasized, the emphasis was very much on tradition. And this growth meant the end of the dream of the evangelical wing of attracting the evangelical Methodists and Conformists back to the old Mother Church. And of course, that was a strong emphasis on for disestablishment from the 1880s on. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Diolch o galon I chi. Unwaith yn rhagor, Wyn. Ni wedi cael 2 gyflwyniad rhagorol heno.
Once again, Wyn. We've had 2 excellent presentations tonight and has opened so much areas. I'm sure during the informal session there'll be much to discuss. I think, does anybody wish to answer any questions or make any comments? And if not, we'll keep the comments to the informal session perhaps, which will follow.
Dwi ddim yn gweld unrhyw sylw yn y chat na unrhyw law I fyny ar hyn o bryd, felly
I can't see any comments or anything in the chat or any hands. I'm sure they're keeping their comments for the next session. Very quickly, when you mentioned that some of the evangelicals in the established church had quite a lot of common ground with the nonconformists and perhaps agreed with the quadrilateral analysis of the essence of evangelism. But then again, they remained faithful to the church. And that's something that perhaps, which characterized their attachment to the evangelical crusade. Yes, that's true. And of course, another matter which I didn't mention, which happens by, if you think of the 3 corners stool, the essences of Anglicanism, the essence of Anglicanism, you could argue at one level the essence of every Christian, the interface between the scripture, tradition and reason. What happens, of course, in this period, you may argue, is that the evangelical wing and the Tractarian wing and the more liberal wing also increase, and socialism, of course, is on the increase. So there's more polarization, I think. And that, as I have suggested to a degree, hastened the campaign towards disestablishment. But yes, these people were faithful to the church, although some of them by the end, they said that the church would benefit from disestablishment. But this was true when you go back to the Methodists of the 18th century. They were quite happy with the 39 articles and the prayer book. They didn't see that contrary to their beliefs. That's extremely interesting, and we see this developing. in the next session, the more in the influence, we'll hear more about the influence of liberalism and of Tractarianism, and perhaps the doubt arising then in the scale of the First World War and the biblical scholarship as to how historically true are the stories we have in the Bible. So it's interesting to hear about the beginning of that polarization, which has definitely been part of our history in the 20th century. So thank you very much, Wyn. And to thank you, Frank, for the two presentations, which have been extremely interesting and have thrown a light on history. When you think of the Blue Books, it was a strange period in the history of the established church, but it's good to hear about somebody like Thomas Phillips, who argued in favour of the Welsh people, in favour of the Welsh language, and against the insulting comments of the commissioners. And then moving on to talk about the period, the unexpected almost revival in the history of the established church in the second part of the 19th century, to hear about the conviction of the evangelical wing, who are willing to stand for those essences of the faith and the basis which you mentioned, which brings a sort of new understanding to life, to the established church. So thank you for you both. We look forward to the session, so stay with us for another half an hour to stay for another session. I'm sure there'll be questions for both speakers, but for the time being, thank you very much. Before, can I remind you, this is the last session in the 8th series. I'm very pleased to say that the 9th series will start very early, soon after Christmas, on the 25th of January. They will be, the spring session will be take place on Saturday mornings. And that's what we followed. So Saturday mornings to begin on the 25th of January. More details will follow from Angharad. So those of you who already subscribe to the circular will see this. But for the time being, thank you all very much. Thank you to our speakers for enlightening us, and to all of you. And when it comes, a very happy Christmas to you all and a happy New Year.